The book of Job also discusses the question of who is responsible. Who is responsible for the many sufferings of Job? And perhaps just as important, who is responsible for other accidents, sufferings, diseases, and events in our world? There are many strong opinions about this issue, but also much uncertainty. The one who usually is blamed is God, the God that the Bible describes as love. In November 2006, the Norwegian newspaper Dagbladet published an article on their webpage which looked at natural disasters and how people from different religions around the world explain why the various disasters have taken place. Among others was mentioned the tsunami in southeastern Asia in 2004, in which more than 280,000 people lost their lives. After the first shock was settled, there was a discussion among some people in the West whether or not this could be a punishment from God of that part of the world. Another example which is mentioned in the article is the Hurricane Katrina, which hit the southeastern part of the United States in August 2005. About 1,500 people died, and many thousands lost their homes. It is this natural disaster which is used for the title of the article in question. The Hurricane Katrina was God's punishment for abortion. This was based on a quote from a Christian group in the USA called Columbia Christians for Life. The article rendered a statement which they shall have given when New Orleans was hit by the hurricane and a flood. Abortion, child sacrifice, is a national sin. Hurricane Katrina is certainly a regional calamity, and it has already had national effects. Repent, America, repent and turn to the only one who can save us, the Lord Jesus Christ. According to this group, the purpose of the hurricane was to hit 5 abortion clinics in the area. They found support for their claim in a satellite picture in which the hurricane resembled a fetus. There were also other religious explanations of why the United States was hit by the Hurricane Katrina. The leader of the Nation of Islam in the USA, Louis Farrakhan, claimed that it was a consequence of U.S. foreign policy. According to Farrakhan, the USA would have to change their course as quickly as possible before the God of righteousness would send forth more natural disasters. These are just a few examples among many. People who do not know God might wonder who He really is. Who is the God of the Bible? Is He the one who sends natural disasters upon the earth, and diseases, and other accidents? Or in other words, is God the one who is responsible? The question about why things happen is a difficult topic. It is a subject with many sides. We will here focus on one of the sides, based on the book of Job. Job was once a wealthy man. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 1,000 oxen, 500 donkeys, and a host of servants who took care of his property. Then one accident happens after the other. The oxen and donkeys are stolen, and the servants who looked after them are killed. The sheep and several servants are killed from a stroke of lightning. The camels are stolen, and the servants killed. Job's children die as a fierce storm arises on the other side of the desert and causes the roof of the house in which they are in to collapse. Not long thereafter, Job himself is hit by a severe, painful disease. He has become lonely, abandoned, and poor. To summarize the sufferings of Job, we can say that they include robbers or stealing of property, murders of the servants, natural disasters, lightning and a fierce storm, perhaps a hurricane, which kills both animals and humans, and disease. A large portion of the book of Job discusses the question of why. Job and his friends disagree on why this happens to Job, but in one thing they do agree: God is responsible. In one of his most famous statements, Job himself says, "Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Later, as his despair increases, he expresses the same conviction with the following words: "For the arrows of the Almighty are within me, the poison whereof drinks up my spirit. The terrors of God do set themselves in array against me." Know now that God has overthrown me, and has compassed me with his net. Have pity on me, O you my friends, for the hand of God has touched me. Also in the statement of Job's friends, we find the belief that God is responsible. For instance, Eliphaz says, "Will he reprove you for fear of you? Will he enter with you into judgment? Is not thy wickedness great? Neither is there any end to thine iniquities. Therefore snares are round about you, and sudden fear troubles you. O darkness, that you cannot see, and abundance of waters cover you." Zophar says, "Know therefore that God exacteth of thee less than thine iniquity deserveth." With a host of arguments, his friends try to convince Job that God has laid these sufferings upon him because he is a sinner. Job disagrees with their explanation, but nevertheless they all agree that God is the one who is responsible, even though they give quite different explanations of why. In the book of Job, we may read about two conversations which take place between God and Satan. In the first, God asks Satan if he has noticed his righteous servant Job. Satan responds with questioning the foundation, or motives, of Job's righteousness. "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have not you made a hedge about him, and about his house, and about all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth your hand now, and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." It is after this conversation that Job loses his children, his servants, and his animals. Yet he does not sin against God. A new conversation then takes place between God and Satan. Again, God asks if Satan has noticed his righteous servant Job. Then God says about Job, "Still he holds fast his integrity, although you have moved me against him to destroy him without cause." Satan, on the other hand, continues to call Job's motives into question. He invites God once more to stretch out his hand and hurt Job. "But put forth your hand now, and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." Soon Job is hit by disease, and his body is covered with painful sores. In these quotations we find statements, both from God and from Satan, that God was responsible for the sufferings and accidents that hit Job and his family. We have the following claims from Satan: "Put forth your hand now, and touch all that he has." Put forth your hand now, and touch his bone and his flesh. And God himself says, You moved me against him to destroy him without cause. If we are to explain, based on the Bible, who is responsible for accidents, diseases, and other negative events, we may perfectly well take a quotation from the book of Job, either from Job, from his friends, from Satan, or from God, and say that the Scripture shows that God is responsible. The statements are undeniably found in the Bible. If we consider these statements as the foundation of truth in themselves, it will be quite natural to conclude that it was God who sent the storm which made the house fall down on Job's children, that it was God who let the lightning hit Job's sheep and servants, that it was God who led the gangs of robbers to steal and kill. Yet there are other statements in the book of Job which shows that this conclusion is wrong. When Satan, during the first conversation, has invited God to stretch out his hand and strike everything Job has, God says to him, Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only on himself put not forth your hand. This statement gives yet another possible explanation of who is behind this. We therefore might ask, is it God's hand or is it Satan's hand that strikes everything Job has? Is it God or Satan who is responsible? In his first accusation against Job, Satan says, Does Job fear God for nothing? Have not you made a hedge about him and about his house, and about all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. Even though Satan's assertion about the motivations of Job's righteousness is wrong, his statement that God has blessed Job is true. It is also correct that God has made a hedge about him and about his house and about all that he has on every side. God has protected Job. He has blessed him, and he has guarded him and his property. What actually happened in the conversation between God and Satan is that Satan is given a permission. Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only on himself put not forth your hand. God gives Satan access to everything Job owns, but he may not touch Job directly. When Satan has been given this permission, he walks away from God. Soon Job loses his animals, his servants, and his children. In the second conversation, which takes place between God and Satan, the latter once again invites God to stretch out his hand against Job, and this time against Job directly. God's response is to give Satan another permission. Behold, he is in your hand, but save his life. The first permission did not allow Satan to touch Job. Now he may. But he is not allowed to take his life. This is where the limit is placed. We are then told that Satan quickly uses the permission to do what his heart desires. So went Satan forth from the presence of the Lord, and smote Job with sore boils, from the sole of his foot to his crown. This quotation is probably the one which most clearly shows who is responsible for the sufferings and losses of Job. We are told that it is God's enemy, Satan, who is behind these. Through his treatment of the innocent man Job, Satan shows what is in his heart, and how he proposes to destroy humans and the creation of God, and thus cause God and men to suffer. This is the very result of his actions. The book of Job, then, shows us that it is Satan who is responsible for natural disasters and accidents, death, robbery, diseases, and pain. The book gives us insight into how he uses the forces of nature, human beings, and pathogenic microorganisms to cause people to suffer, and he does it as often as he is able. It is only God who limits his actions and protects the human beings. The assumption of Job and his friends that the sufferings were a result of God's hand was wrong. Their conclusion was based on a false theory of how things are related. God is love. He does not wish to bring suffering upon his creation. That Satan invited God to stretch out his hand to strike Job's property and his flesh is not the same as saying that God actually did it. It can only be considered a suggestion from Satan and an expression of his way of thinking and acting, not as a description of what actually took place. It was Satan who was responsible for the accidents. God gave him a permission, but he never told Satan to do the things he did. There are two things that are important to remember in this connection: what Satan could have done to Job, but which he chose not to do, and what Satan would have liked to do, but which God did not allow him to do. The first point refers to the fact that Satan could have chosen to strike Job in many other ways than what he did. He also could have used other microorganisms to make Job ill. But if we consider the accidents that struck Job and what they actually meant, it seems as if he chose some of the worst accidents he could think of. The point is that Satan may choose to do something, and he may choose not to. Here many people feel uncertain and confused, especially if they judge a person's righteousness, actions, and preaching based on his or her destiny. But even though a person is not hit by an accident, it does not necessarily mean that this person is more protected by God than others who suffer. Satan does not have to hit people with accidents. He may choose not to do so if he finds that is best. And in many occasions, this also seems to be what serves his cause best. Because of this, people who openly and actively work against God and what he stands for may enjoy wealth, peace, and prosperity, even though God has removed his protection from them. Similarly, a person who preaches a doctrine which is contrary to God's principles still may seem to be blessed and to have God on his side. If we judge something according to the destiny of a person, we might end up with a completely wrong conclusion. The second point is about what Satan would have liked to do against Job, but which God did not allow him to do. This shows that God put a limit to the actions of Satan. After the first conversation with God, Satan was not allowed to touch Job. No matter how strongly he wanted to do so, he was not capable of destroying even a hair on his head. After the second conversation, he got permission to do so. But even when Job was affected by disease, God continued to protect him. Satan had no possibility to take Job's life. God would not allow it. One quotation that might be difficult to understand, though, is God's statement that he has destroyed Job. In the second conversation with Satan, he says, "You moved me against him to destroy him without cause." Why does God here say that it was he who destroyed Job, when it was Satan who was responsible for the destructions? In the book of Isaiah, we find a song which might help us to understand difficult statements, such as the one we find in Job 2, verse 3. The song may also be useful to understand certain events recorded in the Bible, for instance, the story of Israel and their journey through the wilderness. The song in the book of Isaiah is actually a parable, an illustration which is supposed to make the message easier to understand. The illustration used here is a vineyard, God's vineyard.
Now will I sing to my well-beloved, a song of my beloved touching his vineyard. My well-beloved had a vineyard in a very fruitful hill, and he fenced it and gathered out the stones thereof, and planted it with the the choicest vine, and built a tower in the midst of it, and also made a winepress therein. And he looked that it should bring forth grapes, but it brought forth wild grapes. Judge between me and my vineyard. What could have been done more to my vineyard that I have not done in it? Wherefore when I looked at it, should bring forth grapes, brought it forth wild grapes. And now go to, I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away the heads thereof, and it shall be eaten up, and break down the wall thereof, and it shall be trodden down. And I will lay it waste. It shall not be pruned nor digged, but there shall come up briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon
it. This song, or parable, was presented in a certain context. It was told to the Israelites after generations with apostasy from God, worship of idols, and actions contrary to God's basic principles of justice and righteousness. Isaiah tells what the parable means.
For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah is pleasant plant. And he looked for judgment, and behold the oppression, for righteousness but behold the cry.
The vineyard was an illustration of God's people. God had led the Israelites out of the slavery in Egypt and into Canaan. Canaan was a wonderful land, fertile and rich of natural resources. God gave the Israelites different laws and prescriptions, and he gave them the sanctuary service. He also showed them how he would forgive them and change their hearts for the better, if they were willing to surrender themselves completely to him and accept his offer of salvation. Put short, we might say that God has done absolutely everything he could which would benefit the people he had chosen and allow them to bring forth good fruit. The fruit that he expected them to yield was the fruit of righteousness. God had provided the right conditions for this to happen. Yet the vineyard yielded bad fruit. When God looked at the fruit of his people, he only found oppression and acts that made people cry. In the parable, the owner of the vineyard says, "Judge between me and my vineyard. What could have been done more to my vineyard that I have not done in it? Why, when I looked that it should bring forth grapes, brought it forth wild grapes?" we are encouraged to judge about the issue, to judge between the owner of the vineyard and his vineyard. Was it anything the owner of the vineyard had not done or should have done differently to make his vineyard bring forth good fruit? From the description we find in the parable, we see that it was not. The area was fertile. The owner of the vineyard had removed all stones and whatever would prevent the vines from growing. He had planted good vines and built a watchtower. In other words, he had done everything he could in order to make the trees yield good fruit. He therefore had reason to expect good fruit. Despite all of this, the result failed. The vineyard was not only without fruits, but it yielded bad fruit. Did it have any reason for this? It comes as no surprise that the owner of the vineyard asked, "Why brought it forth wild grapes?" The song then tells us what the owner now will do to his vineyard. "I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away the hedge thereof, and it shall be eaten up, and break down the wall thereof, and it shall be trodden down, and I will lay it waste." So far the vineyard had been protected by a fence. Outside the fence there were wild animals, but as long as the fence was there, they could not approach the vines. But in the very moment the owner of the vineyard removed the protecting wall, the wild animals were free to enter. Consequently, the vineyard would be eaten up and trodden down. This parable gives a very good illustration of the problem in question. It is not difficult to see that it is the wild animals that destroy the vineyard. Still, the owner of the vineyard says, "I will lay it waste." Why does he say that he is the one who will lay it waste when it is the wild animals that carry out the destruction? It is because he has the power to protect his vineyard and power not to do it. The wild animals were there all the time. Maybe they were hungry and longed to eat from the fruit of the fertile hill where the vineyard was situated. But the owner of the vineyard had built a wall around the vineyard, which prevented the animals from doing what they wanted. It was he who prevented them from hurting the vines. But when the vineyard, despite what one should expect, only yielded bad fruit, the owner of the vineyard decided to remove the fence. Now there was nothing that could prevent the animals from entering. It was not the owner that led them into the vineyard and made their mouth bite off the plants, but he gave them a possibility, a permission. We find that the owner of the vineyard had power to protect his vineyard and power not to do it. Therefore he could say, "I will lay it waste," even though he was not the one who was responsible for the destructions themselves. The Song of God's Vineyard is a useful tool to analyze other stories of the Bible which might be difficult to understand, especially in regard to why things happen the way it does. While the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness, many dramatic events took place. One of these happened as they, after 40 years in the desert, headed back towards Canaan to finally conquer the Promised Land. The people want to travel through the land of Edom, but the king of Edom does not allow them. Hence, they have to go around the country, and once again they turn their back toward Canaan. They then move southward toward the Red Sea, through a desolate area. Here, their faith and their patience are tested, and it is now that the special event takes place. "And they journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea, to compass the land of Edom. And the soul of the people were much discouraged because of the way. And the people spoke against God and against Moses. 'Why have you brought us up out of the land of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no bread, neither is there any water, and our souls loathe this light bread. And the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much people of Israel died. Therefore the people came to Moses and said, We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he may take away the serpents from us. And Moses prayed for the people. And the Lord said to Moses, Make you a fiery serpent, and set it on a pole, and it shall come to pass that every one that is bitten, when he looks on it, shall live. The Israelites blamed God and Moses for the possible danger that they might die from thirst or hunger in the desert. They have completely forgotten that they 40 years earlier stood by the borders of Canaan, but refused to enter in because they did not trust in God. This was the real reason why they had to spend 40 years in the wilderness. They had said that they had wished to die in the wilderness, and God fulfilled their wish. Still, God had covered their needs for all these 40 years. He had provided for them food and water, but now they seem to have forgotten how great a blessing this actually was. They are dissatisfied and complain about God's solution. It is then it happens. And the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much people of Israel died. What is described is a very severe event, but we also find that the people do not complain against God when it happens, as they without reason previously had done. Instead, they now turn to Moses and confess their sin, something which shows that they are fully aware that the accusations against God and Moses were unfair and serious. Among other things, they had claimed that God wanted to make them suffer, but they realized that they themselves were the real cause for the entry of the snakes. But the people also know that God can help them. They asked Moses to make intercession for them. Even though Moses also has been treated unfair, he is willing to pray for the people. God then asked Moses to make a bronze snake and place it on a pole, and to tell the people that those who have been bitten by the poisonous snakes might be healed if they look upon it. It was, of course, nothing magic with the bronze snake itself. Rather, it was a question of trust in God and His Word. Every time an Israelite who had been bitten by a poisonous snake looked at the bronze snake, this was an act of faith which showed that he or she believed that God would do as He had promised. He would give them life and health. The dramatic event with the bronze snake is an eloquent illustration of Jesus and what God will do for those who believe in Him. What is interesting in our connection, though, is the statement that the Lord sent poisonous snakes into the camp so that many were bitten and died. And the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much people of Israel died. If we look at this quotation isolated, we may easily get the impression that God got angry with the Israelites and led the snakes into the camp to hurt them. But if we consider the event in the light of the song of God's vineyard, we find a different story. The Israelites, God's chosen people, yielded bad fruit. The accusations against God showed that they had a basic distrust in Him. It might, of course, be appropriate to ask whether they were capable of entering Canaan the way that they were now, or if they would only repeat the same mistakes as their forefathers some 40 years earlier. Nevertheless, the fruit they now brought forth was bad fruit, despite everything God had done for them. The owner of the vineyard therefore said, "What could have been done more to my vineyard, that I have not done in it? Why, when I looked that it should bring forth grapes, brought it forth wild grapes. And now go to, I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away the hedge thereof, and it shall be eaten up, and break down the wall thereof, and it shall be trodden down, and I will lay it waste." For more than 40 years, God had protected the Israelites against snakes and other dangerous animals that lived in the desolate area where they traveled. Later, when Moses reminds the people on how they were led out from Egypt to Canaan, he gives a short description of the area. The Lord your God led you through that great and terrible wilderness, wherein were fiery serpents and scorpions. The poisonous snakes were there all the time, but they could not come near the Israelites because God protected them. There was a fence which prevented them from hurting his vineyard. But when the fence was removed, because of the bad fruits of the vines, they got the possibility to enter into the camp. Many Israelites were bit and died. Even though the text says that the Lord sent the poisonous snakes among the people, he did not call on the snakes and lead them into the camp. The owner of the vineyard had power to protect his vineyard, and he had power not to do it. He therefore could say, "I will lay it waste." But it was his enemy who was responsible for the destruction. We may now return to the book of Job and take yet another look at the first conversation between God and Satan, this time in the light of the song of God's vineyard. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have not you made a hedge about him, and about his house, and about all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth your hand now, and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only on himself put not forth your hand." So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. When the song of God's vineyard now is put in connection with the book of Job, it is not to indicate that God removed his protection or his fence from Job because Job had brought forth bad fruit and therefore had to repent. This is what Job's friends think is the reason why God hits Job with sufferings. But as we saw in part 1, Job's friends had a wrong understanding of God and how things are related. This is also something which God later rebukes them for. The purpose of mentioning the song of God's vineyard here is on the other hand to show that difficult texts, such as the one which says that God's hand would strike Job, or when God says, "You moved me against him to destroy him without cause," do not have to be difficult texts. Rather, they can be seen as a way of talking. We often find this in the Old Testament. Some examples are the statement that God will call on the Babylonians to destroy Judah, or when God calls the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, his servant. Another famous example is the statement that God hardened the heart of Pharaoh. It is interesting that we also find other verses which say that it was Pharaoh who hardened his own heart. Also, the second conversation between God and Satan may be more easily understood in the light of the parable of God's vineyard. And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that fears God and eschews evil? And still he holds fast his integrity, although you moved me against him to destroy him without cause." And Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin, yes, all that a man has will he give for his life. But put forth your hand now, and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your hand, but save his life." So went Satan forth from the presence of the Lord, and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot to his crown. The question about why God gave Satan permission to strike Job and his property is complicated. we may still find some answers in the two conversations which took place between God and Satan, as well as in the question that is raised about the foundation or the motivation for Job's righteousness and fear of God. Does he follow God only because he benefits from God's blessings, or does he really love God above all? We might get even some more answers if we read the 38th to the 41st chapter in the book and try to answer the questions which are raised there. But we will not look at this in details now. Instead, we shall try to sum up some of the most important things we might learn from the book of Job when it comes to the question about who is responsible for accidents, natural disasters, suffering, diseases, and death. It is not God, but his enemy, Satan, who is responsible. He uses both the forces of nature, microorganisms, humans, and animals to make people suffer. Disasters and similar events show us the attitudes and politics of Satan, what he stands for, as a contrast to what God stands for. Hence it is wrong when Christians or others claim that God is responsible, whether it is a worldwide catastrophe or a personal tragedy. Such claims create a false representation of who God is. God is love, and just as we may read about Satan's character in the accidents, sufferings, and other painful events that take place around us, we may read about God's character in the book of nature, in what we may see in the nature surrounding us. Despite all the centuries of destruction from the powers of nature and human beings, it is still a beautiful book, and it tells us that God still is love.